my daughter held up two dog tags dangling from a chain gone dull with age and asked me a question I had spent 50 years making sure nobody would ever ask. "Dad," she said, "who is Daniel R. Whitfield?" I stood in the doorway of my own attic with my hands still on the light switch, and for a moment I couldn't make my mouth work. The tags spun slowly in the light from the bare bulb overhead. I knew the sound they made before they even moved. I'd heard that small metal click 1,000 times in my sleep. "Where did you find those?" I finally said. It wasn't really a question. My voice came out flatter than I meant it to. Sarah was 38 years old, my only child, and she'd never once heard me raise my voice in anger. She heard something else in it now, and she took a step back without meaning to. "In the trunk."
Under your old uniforms.
"Dad, whose name is this?" I looked at those tags in her hand, and I felt the years fall away like a floor giving out beneath me. 50 years. 50 years I'd kept that box locked and taped and buried under things nobody would ever want to move. And here was my daughter standing in the attic in September, holding the one thing I had never let anyone touch. I didn't answer her that night. I told her I was tired. I told her we'd talk about it another time. She looked at me the way she used to look at me when she was 7 years old and knew I was lying about something small, like whether I'd finished the vegetables on my plate. But this wasn't small, and she knew that too. What she didn't know, what nobody in my life had known for half a century, was that I had a brother and that I came home from Vietnam, and he didn't. I grew up in a town called Millbrook, Ohio, population 2,000 and shrinking every year since the mill closed. My father worked the line at a tire plant in Akron, 40 minutes each way, and my mother kept the house and kept us fed on whatever she could stretch the furthest. We didn't have much. Nobody in Millbrook had much. But we had each other, and back then that seemed like enough. I was the oldest. Danny came along 2 years after me, and from the day he could walk, he followed me everywhere. That's just how it was with brothers close in age. I'd go fishing at the creek behind the Hendersons' property, and there'd be Danny, 10 steps behind, carrying his own rod, even though he never once managed to bait a hook without help. He was better than me at almost everything, if I'm honest. Better at baseball, better with girls, better at making people laugh in a room. I used to get frustrated with him for it when we were boys, the way brothers do, but underneath that frustration was something simpler. I loved him. I loved him the plain, uncomplicated way you love someone you've never had to imagine life without. Our father used to say Danny had the gift of ease. Things came easy to him. Friends came easy to him. Even trouble came easy to him, and somehow he always slid right out of it before it could stick. I was the responsible one. The one who fixed the truck when it broke down, who walked Danny home from the bar in Millbrook when he'd had one too many at 18, who covered for him with our mother more times than I could count. That was the shape of our whole lives. I looked after Danny. Danny made everyone around him a little happier just by being there. Neither of us thought much about the war until it stopped being something that happened to other families. The letter came for me first, October of 1968. I was 20 years old, working at the hardware store on Main Street, saving up to maybe start community college the following fall. I remember standing at the counter reading it twice because the first time, I don't think the words actually landed. My mother cried when I told her. My father didn't say anything for a long time. He just nodded slowly, the way men of his generation did when something was happening that they couldn't stop and had decided not to fight. Danny's letter came 6 weeks later. I remember the exact moment he told me because I remember wishing for just one selfish second that it hadn't happened. Not because I didn't love my brother, because some small, cowardly part of me had been holding on to the hope that at least one of us would stay behind. That our mother wouldn't have to stand at the window every night watching for 2 sets of headlights instead of one. "We'll go together," Danny said. He was smiling when he said it, like it was good news. Whitfield brothers, they won't know what hit them. I didn't smile back right away. I remember looking at him, 22 years old, still with that easy grin, still looking like the world hadn't figured out yet that it could hurt him, and feeling something tighten in my chest that I didn't have a name for at the time. I know the name for it now. It was fear. Not for myself, for him. We shipped out together in the spring of 1969, and for a while having Danny there made the whole thing bearable. We weren't in the same unit. The Army didn't work that way, not usually, but by some stroke of luck, or maybe some clerk's mercy, we ended up stationed close enough to see each other every few weeks. Close enough that when word came through that a supply truck was headed toward my camp, and Danny had talked his sergeant into hitching a ride, so I'd walk out to the road and wait for him like we were still boys back home, waiting for the school bus. He'd bring cigarettes he didn't smoke, just to trade. He'd bring letters from our mother that had gotten routed to his camp instead of mine. He'd bring that same grin, dust-covered and sunburned, and for 20 minutes at a time, Vietnam would feel a little less like the end of the world. "You look terrible," he told me once, laughing, when I hadn't slept in 2 days. "You look worse," I said, which wasn't true, and we both knew it, and that was exactly why it was funny. I want you to understand something about my brother before I tell you what happened. He wasn't reckless. People think of young soldiers as reckless, like they didn't understand what could happen to them. Danny understood. He'd seen enough by then. What Danny had instead of recklessness was a kind of loyalty that didn't know how to stay in its lane. If someone in his unit was struggling, Danny carried extra weight without being asked. If a new kid was scared out of his mind on his first patrol, Danny stayed close to him, talked him through it, made jokes to keep his hands from shaking. That was Danny. That was always Danny. It's also, in the end, what got him killed. I've told this next part to exactly nobody in 50 years. Not my late wife, Carol, who I was married to for 31 years before cancer took her. Not my closest Army buddies, the 2 or 3 I stayed in touch with over the decades. Not the VA counselor I saw exactly once, back in 1974, before I decided I'd rather carry it myself than watch it change how anyone looked at me. I'm telling it now because my daughter deserves the truth, and because I'm 76 years old, and I've finally understood something it took me a lifetime to learn. The things we bury don't disappear. They just wait. It was August 1969. Danny's unit and mine had been pulled together for a joint operation near a village whose name I've chosen not to say out loud in 50 years, not even to myself. We were moving through terrain that felt wrong the whole day. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that made the hair on your arms stand up even in 90-degree heat. There was a kid in Danny's unit named Ochoa, 19 years old, from Texas, scared down to his boots on his 3rd week in country. Danny had taken him under his wing the way he did with every scared kid who crossed his path. We took fire near a tree line just after 1400 hours. I was maybe 40 yards from Danny when it started. I remember the sound before I remember anything else. That flat crack that doesn't sound like anything in the movies, nothing like what you expect. Ochoa froze, just froze, right out in the open, the way green soldiers sometimes do the first time it's real instead of training. Danny went after him. I saw it happen. I've seen it happen every night since, in the version of sleep that isn't really sleep, more like a film reel that starts up the second I close my eyes. Danny running low, reaching Ochoa, shoving him toward cover with both hands, and then Danny didn't make it back himself. I don't remember screaming, but they told me later I did. I don't remember running toward him, but I have a scar on my forearm from concertina wire that I have no other explanation for. What I remember clearly, the way you remember the worst thing that will ever happen to you, is reaching my brother and knowing, before I even got close enough to touch him, that it was already over. He was 23 years old. They flew him home in a box with a flag on it. I flew home 3 months later, when my own tour ended, in a body that walked and breathed and answered to my name, but that I did not, for a very long time, feel like I was actually living in. I've had 50 years to think about why I did what I did next, and I still don't have a clean answer. Grief does strange things to a man's mind. It rearranges the furniture of who you thought you were and doesn't leave a note explaining where anything went. When I got home, my parents were destroyed. My mother had already buried her younger son. She had a folded flag on the mantel and a photograph next to it that she couldn't walk past without touching. And there I was, alive, whole, home, and every single day, every single time she looked at me, I could see her doing the math. Why him and not you? She never said it. She would never have said it. But I saw it in her eyes anyway, because I was doing the same math myself, every hour of every day, and I didn't have a better answer than she did. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I made myself smaller. I stopped talking about Vietnam entirely. Not the good, not the bad, none of it. When people asked, I said I served, and that was all I said. When my mother wanted to talk about Danny, I let her talk, but I never told her the part I've just told you. I never told her I was 40 yards away. I never told her I got there almost in time. I let her believe her son died bravely in a firefight, which was true, but I never gave her the rest of it, because I was afraid that if I said it out loud, if I said I watched it happen and I couldn't stop it, something in me would come apart that I would never be able to put back together. I took his dog tags off his gear before they shipped his body home. I don't fully know why, even now. Maybe I wanted something of him that was only mine. Maybe I couldn't stand the thought of them ending up in a box in a government warehouse somewhere, unclaimed, unremembered. I put them in my duffel bag and then a small tin box, and then, years later, in a trunk in an attic, and I never once in 50 years told a living soul they existed. I met Carol 2 years after I came home. She was a school teacher, patient in a way I didn't deserve, and she never once pushed me to talk about the war beyond the basic facts I gave her. I think she understood, without my ever explaining it, that there was a door in me that stayed shut and that pushing on it would do more harm than good. We had Sarah in 1976. I loved her the second I saw her, the same plain, uncomplicated way I'd loved Danny, and I promised myself, silently, the way I made most of my promises back then, that I would give her a father who was steady, present, whole. I didn't always manage it. There were nights I disappeared into myself so completely that Carol had to explain to a 6-year-old why Daddy wasn't talking at dinner. But I tried. God knows I tried. What I never did, not once in 38 years of being her father, is tell Sarah she'd had an uncle. I want to be honest about something. It wasn't only grief that kept me quiet all those years. It was shame too. Tangled up so tightly with the grief that for a long time I couldn't tell the two of them apart. I told myself a story for 50 years. The story went like this. I should have gotten there faster. I should have seen it coming. I should have been the one who went after Ochoa instead of Danny, because Danny had a mother who needed him more than mine needed me, because Danny was better, because Danny was the one everybody loved, and somehow I was the one who came home. None of that was fair to me. I know that now, mostly. The counselor I finally saw, decades too late, told me something that took me another 2 years to actually believe. That survivor's guilt isn't logic, it's a wound dressed up to look like logic. It convinces you that you did something wrong simply by continuing to exist. But knowing that and feeling it are two very different things. I spent 5 decades feeling like a man who owed a debt he could never pay off, and the only way I knew how to manage that feeling was to never let anyone close enough to ask about it. Which is exactly what my daughter did, standing in my attic on a Tuesday evening in September, holding a set of dog tags that weren't mine. Sarah didn't let it go. I hadn't expected her to. She was raised by a school teacher and an ex-soldier, and if there's one thing both of us gave her without meaning to, it's the inability to leave an unanswered question sitting quietly in a room. 3 days after the attic, she showed up at my house on a Saturday morning with 2 coffees and a look on her face that told me she wasn't leaving until she got something. Dad, she said, setting the coffee down in front of me at my kitchen table. The same table Carol and I had eaten 1,000 breakfasts at before she passed. I looked him up. Daniel R. Whitfield. Same birthday as your service record, 2 years apart. Same hometown. I stared at the coffee. I didn't drink it. He's your brother, she said. Not a question this time. I have an uncle I never knew about. Had, I said quietly. It was the first word I'd spoken on the subject in 50 years, and it came out smaller than I meant it to. You had an uncle. Sarah sat down across from me slowly, the way you'd sit down next to someone standing at the edge of something high up, careful not to make any sudden movements. Tell me, she said, and I want you to understand I almost didn't. 50 years of silence is its own kind of gravity. It pulls you back towards staying quiet even when part of you desperately wants to speak. I sat there for what felt like 10 minutes, though it was probably closer to 2, turning that coffee cup in a slow circle on the table, feeling the old walls in me holding firm even as something behind them pushed harder than it ever had before. What finally broke, it wasn't courage, it was her face. She looked at me the way I imagine my mother must have looked at me all those years ago. Not with anger, not with judgment, just with a kind of open, patient love that was waiting for me to trust it. I hadn't let anyone look at me like that in a very long time. His name was Danny, I said. And then slowly, in pieces, with more silences than sentences, I told her everything. I told her about Millbrook and the creek behind the Hendersons' place and the way Danny used to follow me around as a boy carrying a fishing rod he never learned to use properly. I told her about the letters coming 6 weeks apart and Danny's grin when he said, "Whitfield brothers, they won't know what hit them." I told her about the supply trucks and the cigarettes he didn't smoke and the 20 minutes at a time that made an unbearable place feel briefly bearable. Sarah didn't interrupt me once. She just sat there with both hands wrapped around her coffee cup, letting it go cold, listening the way you listen when you know the person talking might stop again if you say the wrong thing. When I got to August 1969, my voice started to go. I hadn't cried in front of another human being since Carol's funeral, and before that, I genuinely could not tell you the last time. But sitting at that kitchen table, describing the sound of gunfire I'd spent 5 decades trying not to hear, watching my brother run toward a scared 19-year-old kid instead of toward cover, I felt something crack open in my chest that had been sealed shut for so long I'd almost forgotten it was there at all. "He saved a man's life," I told her, and my voice broke completely on the word saved. "A kid named Ochoa, 19 years old. Danny went after him because that's who Danny was. He never thought twice about things like that. And I was 40 yards away, and I ran, but I didn't run fast enough, and I couldn't finish the sentence. I sat there at my own kitchen table, 76 years old, and I cried the way I imagine I should have cried in 1969 if I'd let myself. Sarah got up from her chair and came around the table and put her arms around me, the same way she used to when she was a little girl, and had a bad dream. She didn't say anything for a long time. She just held on. "Dad," she finally said, "why didn't you ever tell me?" I wiped my face with the back of my hand, feeling foolish and unburdened all at once. 2 things I hadn't expected could exist together. "Because I thought if I said it out loud, it would mean it was true," I said. "And because I was ashamed. I came home and he didn't. And I never found a way to make peace with that. So I just didn't talk about it. I told myself I was protecting you, protecting your grandmother. But mostly I think I was protecting myself." "You don't have to protect me from him," Sarah said quietly. "I would have loved to know about him. I would have loved to know I had an uncle who ran toward danger to save someone. That's not something to hide, Dad. That's something to be proud of." I looked at her. My daughter, 38 years old, holding those dog tags gently in one hand like they were something sacred, which I suppose by then they had become. And I felt, for the first time in 50 years, like maybe the debt I'd been carrying wasn't mine to pay alone anymore. That conversation didn't fix 50 years overnight. Grief doesn't work that way, and neither does shame. But it opened a door that had been welded shut for so long I'd forgotten there was a room behind it. Over the following weeks, Sarah asked more questions, gently, a few at a time, never pushing harder than I could handle. She asked about my parents, about Millbrook, about what Danny was like as a boy. She wanted to know the ordinary things too, not just the ending. What his laugh sounded like, whether he was a good student, whether he'd had a girlfriend before he shipped out. I found, to my own surprise, that I remembered all of it. 50 years of silence hadn't erased a single detail. It had just kept everything locked in a room I refused to enter. And now that the door was open, the memories came pouring back. Most of them good, most of them the kind of thing I'd been too afraid to touch because I thought grief was the only room in that house. It wasn't. There was a whole life of love in there too. One evening in October, Sarah asked me something I hadn't expected. "Do you know anything about Ochoa? The man Danny saved?" I told her I didn't, not really. I knew his name and where he was from, that was all. I'd never tried to find him. Some part of me, I admitted to her, had been afraid to. Afraid he'd tell me something about that day that made it worse. Afraid, honestly, of what it would feel like to look into the eyes of the man my brother died saving. "I think you need to find him," Sarah said. "Not for me, for you." I sat with that for a long while. It took nearly a month of searching, mostly done by Sarah, who turned out to have more patience for internet genealogy work than I ever would have. Ochoa, his full name was Ramon Ochoa, had survived the war, come home to Texas, worked 30 years as an electrician, and passed away 4 years earlier. But he'd had a family, a wife, 3 grown children. Sarah found his daughter, a woman named Elena, living outside San Antonio, and asked if I'd be willing to call her. I almost didn't. I sat with the phone in my hand for the better part of an hour before I finally dialed. Elena Ochoa answered on the third ring, and when I explained who I was, the brother of the soldier who'd pulled her father to cover in August of 1969, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. I thought for a moment I'd made a mistake, that I'd opened something in her family that had been better left closed, the same way I'd kept mine closed for 50 years. Then she started to cry. "My father talked about your brother for the rest of his life," she told me, her voice thick. "He named my brother after him, Daniel. We grew up hearing the story, how a man ran through gunfire to pull him to safety, how he never even got a chance to thank him properly before your brother was gone. My father used to say Danny Whitfield gave him 50 extra years he never should have had. 50 years he got to spend with his kids and his grandkids. He said not a single day went by that he didn't think about that." I sat in my kitchen, alone except for the phone against my ear, and I felt something settle in me that I hadn't felt in half a century. It wasn't relief exactly. Relief is too small a word. It was closer to understanding, the kind that doesn't erase grief but finally gives it somewhere to rest. Danny hadn't died for nothing. He died so that a 19-year-old kid from Texas could grow up, get married, raise 3 children, become a grandfather, live a whole life he never would have had otherwise. My brother's last act on this earth had rippled outward into decades of birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesday mornings for a family he never got to meet. I hadn't known that. For 50 years I hadn't known that because I'd been too afraid to ask. Elena invited Sarah and me to visit. In November, we flew to San Antonio, and I stood in a modest backyard in Texas and met a family that existed, in part because my brother had chosen someone else's life over his own safety. Elena's brother, Daniel, 49 years old, named after a man he'd never met, shook my hand and held it a beat longer than a handshake usually lasts. "Thank you," he said, "for finally letting us find you." I hadn't done the finding. Sarah had, but I understood what he meant. 50 years, and I had been the missing piece in a story that had been waiting patiently on the other side of the country for someone to close the circle. That evening, sitting at Elena's kitchen table over plates of food I couldn't have named, but will never forget the taste of, I told them the same story I'd told Sarah in my own kitchen weeks before. Millbrook, the creek, the letters 6 weeks apart, the grin, the 20 minutes at a time. And this time, when I got to August 1969, I found I could say it without breaking entirely. Not because it hurt less, because I finally understood it wasn't only mine to carry. I want to tell you what changed after that, because I think it matters more than the story of what happened 50 years ago. Grief doesn't have an ending. Not really. I don't think it's supposed to. But it can change shape. It can stop being a locked room and start being something closer to a photograph you keep on the mantle. Still there, still able to bring tears if you look at it too long, but no longer something you have to hide from the people you love. Sarah had those dog tags cleaned and put in a small display case, and she asked me if she could keep them at her house on a shelf next to a photograph we'd found of Danny in his uniform, laughing at something outside the camera's frame. I said yes. It felt right. Somehow, for them to live somewhere they'd be seen, instead of buried in a trunk under old uniforms in an attic nobody visited. We drove back to Millbrook that December, the two of us, and stood together at my parents' graves, and for the first time in my life, I said Danny's whole story out loud, standing right there, the way I should have told my mother 50 years before. I told her everything, that I was 40 yards away, that I ran but couldn't reach him in time, that I'd carried the shame of surviving him for half a century because I never let myself understand that surviving wasn't a betrayal. I don't know if she heard me wherever she is, but I felt lighter walking away from that cemetery than I had in 50 years. And I think that counts for something, even if I can't explain exactly why. Sarah has since started asking me to tell her stories about my time in the service. Not just the hardest one, but the ordinary ones too. The friends I made, the letters I sent home, the small kindnesses men show each other in impossible places. I find I don't mind telling them anymore. Some evenings we sit on my porch and she asks a question and I answer it. And somewhere in the middle of that ordinary conversation, I catch myself thinking that this is what I should have been doing for the last 38 years, and grieving gently for all the time I lost being afraid. Last month, Sarah had a photograph framed. Danny at 19, before any of it, grinning at the camera the way he always did, like the whole world was about to surprise him with something good. She hung it in her living room, right next to a photo of me at the same age. Two brothers, side by side again, after 50 years apart. I still think about him every day. I probably always will. But it's different now. For a long time, thinking about Danny meant walking straight into the worst afternoon of my life and staying there. Now, more often than not, it means remembering a boy with a fishing rod he never learned to bait properly, following me down to the creek behind the Hendersons' place, grinning like he already knew something good was coming. He did know, I think. Danny always did. See, if you've ever carried something in silence because you were afraid of what it would mean to say it out loud, I hope you know this. The people who love you can carry more than you think. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't running toward the danger. It's finally telling someone the truth about the day you didn't. Has there ever been something in your own family's past that stayed hidden far longer than it should have? I'd love to hear about it, if you're willing to share.